The strangest thing about this week in London isn't what happened inside the courtroom. It's what may have happened outside of it. Because while Prince Harry sat just a few miles from Buckingham Palace, listening as lawyers debated phone hacking, privacy, and press abuse, something else was reportedly unfolding behind closed doors. Something quieter, tenser, and, if accounts are accurate, far more explosive than anything said on the record. Here's the contradiction that should stop you cold. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. On the surface, this was a legal story. A duke versus a newspaper group. Allegations against Associated Newspapers, publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. Claims of unlawful information gathering. A defendant that vigorously denies everything. Clean lines. Familiar territory. But timing is everything. Prince Harry didn't return to London randomly. He returned at a moment when the monarchy is fragile, when public trust is uneven, and when silence inside the royal household has become policy. And yet, according to multiple sources, silence didn't hold. Because somewhere between court appearances, a private reunion was allegedly arranged. Not photographed, not announced, no waving, no smiles. Just 3 men in a room. King Charles III, Prince William, Prince Harry. If that alone doesn't raise questions, it should. Why now? Why during an active trial? And why, after years of managed distance, would the family choose this exact moment to sit down, without cameras, without official statements, without a carefully crafted narrative? Because here's what's unsettling. Trials don't just expose evidence. They expose motives. They reopen old wounds. And for a family already divided over the press, over responsibility, over who protected whom, this case strikes directly at the fault line. Harry says this fight is about accountability, about truth, about what was done to him and others when no one was watching. Inside the palace, that same fight may look very different. It may look like risk, like unpredictability, like a son who won't stop pulling at threads the institution worked very hard to knot back together. So ask yourself this. If you were the king, would you see this lawsuit as justice being pursued or damage being invited? And if you were the heir, watching your brother return, not to reconcile, but to testify, how long would you stay quiet? Because according to people briefed on what followed, this reunion didn't unfold calmly. It didn't drift politely, and it certainly didn't end in agreement. In fact, one source described a single moment, one sentence, after which the tone in the room changed completely. And once that happened, there was no walking it back. The trial was never supposed to feel like this. On paper, it's procedural. Dates, motions, legal arguments about what journalists did or didn't do more than a decade ago. But if you watched Prince Harry walk into London's High Court this week, you could sense it immediately. This wasn't a routine appearance. This was personal, and heavier than the paperwork suggested. Here's the thing that often gets missed. This case isn't just about alleged phone hacking or private investigators. It's about narrative control. About who gets to define the past and who pays the price for it. Harry's lawsuit pulls at something the royal family has spent years trying to contain. The idea that the press wasn't merely intrusive, but enabled. That lines were crossed. And that those crossings were, at times, quietly tolerated. That's why the timing matters so much. As Harry took the stand, accusing a powerful media group of illegally gathering private information, the monarchy was placed in an impossible position. Publicly, it must remain neutral, above the fray, silent. But privately, this trial drags old decisions back into the light. Decisions about cooperation, about access, about who was protected and who wasn't. Harry has been clear about one thing. He believes this is a fight he has to see through, not just for himself, but for others who couldn't. And that belief hardens every time he returns to court. Every time lawyers rehash stories that, for him, are lived memory rather than legal argument. Ask yourself this. What happens when one member of the royal family insists on accountability, while the rest depend on discretion to survive? Because from inside palace circles, this lawsuit isn't viewed as isolated. It's viewed as destabilizing. Not because of what's already known, but because of what could still come out. Testimony has a way of widening, of drifting into uncomfortable territory. And once something is said in court, it can't be unsaid. That's where anxiety crept in. Sources close to the situation describe mounting concern as Harry's court appearances approached. Not panic. Something colder than that. Calculation. The realization that this trial could reshape more than press standards. It could reopen family dynamics the institution thought were settled. And that's when conversations reportedly began. Quiet ones. Careful ones. The kind that don't leave a paper trail. If Harry was determined to push forward publicly, could something be managed privately? Could boundaries be reinforced? Could expectations be reset before testimony hardened into something irreversible? But here's the contradiction no one can escape. You can't ask for unity while bracing for exposure. You can't demand silence from someone who believes silence is what caused the damage in the first place. Which raises the question that hangs over everything. Did the trial force the reunion? Or did fear of what the trial might reveal make that meeting unavoidable? Because according to those familiar with what followed, the moment the legal case entered the room, the atmosphere changed. What began as a conversation about timing reportedly shifted into something sharper, more personal, and far less controlled. And once the subject of responsibility surfaced, the discussion stopped being strategic and started becoming emotional. What happened next is where the accounts diverge. But they all agree on one thing. That meeting didn't stay calm for long. There's a detail that keeps surfacing in every version of this story, no matter who tells it. The meeting wasn't meant to heal anything. It wasn't framed as reconciliation, or closure, or even forgiveness. It was framed as necessary. And that distinction matters more than it sounds, because necessity carries pressure. It carries expectations. It carries an unspoken demand that someone, eventually, gives ground. According to people familiar with the setup, the atmosphere was controlled at first. Almost formal. Polite in that restrained, brittle way that suggests everyone is measuring every word. No raised voices. No immediate accusations. Just careful statements. Carefully chosen pauses. But that calm didn't last. Because once the trial entered the conversation, not as a headline, but as a lived reality, the dynamic shifted. The lawsuit wasn't discussed as a legal proceeding. It was discussed as a risk, as something with consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. This is where the tension reportedly began to build. Harry, by all accounts, wasn't interested in moderating his position. He didn't fly thousands of miles to listen quietly while others explained the optics. He has said, repeatedly, that this case is about accountability, about drawing a line that should have been drawn years ago. And when he speaks about it, there's very little flexibility in his tone. That rigidity, whether you agree with it or not, has an effect in a room like that. Because from the perspective of the institution, accountability is complicated. It invites questions. It invites retrospection. It invites scrutiny that doesn't stop neatly at one newspaper group. And as those implications were reportedly laid out, the room grew heavier. One source described a moment of silence after the trial was mentioned directly. Not awkward. Calculated. The kind of silence where everyone knows the conversation has crossed into dangerous territory, but no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. And then someone did. The comment itself, according to those briefed afterward, wasn't explosive. It wasn't shouted. It was framed as concern, as caution, as a reminder of what was at stake, not just for Harry, but for everyone connected to him. That's when the emotional lines hardened. Harry reportedly pushed back, challenging the idea that protecting the institution should come at the cost of truth, that the damage had already been done, not by the lawsuit, but by years of inaction, years of silence that, in his view, allowed abuses to continue. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same argument he's made publicly. The difference here is that this time, he wasn't speaking to reporters. He was speaking to family. And family complicates everything. Because concern can sound like control, warnings can feel like pressure, and advice, no matter how carefully phrased, can land as betrayal when trust has already eroded. Ask yourself this. If you believe the system failed you, how would you react to being told that challenging it might cause harm? According to multiple accounts, that's when the conversation stopped being abstract. Voices didn't necessarily rise, but the temperature in the room did. The focus shifted away from legal strategy and toward responsibility. Past decisions, missed interventions, and who, exactly, should have done more when it mattered. This is the point where insiders say the meeting veered off script. Because once those questions surfaced, There was no longer a shared objective. There were only opposing truths, sitting across from each other, refusing to move. And that's when one brother reportedly said something that changed the entire tone of the room. What that was, and how the others reacted, would turn a tense conversation into something far more volatile. Whatever was said in that moment wasn't dramatic in the way people expect drama to look. No slammed doors. No shouting that could be overheard down a corridor. No theatrical gestures. In fact, what made it destabilizing was how controlled it was. Measured. Delivered with enough restraint that it couldn't be dismissed as emotional excess. According to those familiar with the exchange, this was the point where Prince William stepped in more forcefully. Not as a mediator, not as a bridge, but as someone drawing a boundary. For years, William has been positioned, publicly and privately, as the stabilizing force. The future king. The one tasked with holding the institution together while everything around it shifts. And in that room, as the conversation spiraled away from strategy and toward grievance, that role reportedly took over. The argument, as described afterward, wasn't about whether Harry had been hurt. That wasn't contested. The fracture came from what Harry intended to do with that hurt, and what it might cost everyone else. William, sources say, framed his concern around consequence, around permanence. Once testimony is given, once accusations are formalized, once implications spread, they don't stay contained. They ripple outward, into other cases, other decisions, other moments the family thought were closed chapters. To Harry, that framing landed badly. Because to him, consequence is the point. If you listen carefully to how Harry talks about this lawsuit, there's an underlying belief that disruption is necessary, that discomfort is overdue, that nothing changes unless someone is willing to absorb the blowback. And when William reportedly questioned the scale of that disruption, what it could trigger, who it might implicate, it sounded less like caution and more like resistance. That's when the exchange reportedly sharpened. Harry is said to have pushed back hard against the idea that he should temper his actions for the sake of optics, that he had already done that for years, that protecting the institution had come at a personal cost he was no longer willing to pay. And here's the part that lingers. According to one account, Harry questioned whether anyone in that room would have acted differently if the roles were reversed, if they had been the target, if they had lived with the fallout while others moved on. It's an uncomfortable question, and in that moment, it didn't require an answer to do damage. Because once that line was crossed, the conversation reportedly stopped being about the trial at all. It became about loyalty, about who stood up and who stayed silent when it mattered most. King Charles, by most accounts, said little during this exchange. Not because he wasn't affected, but because he was caught between two positions that no longer overlapped. A son demanding reckoning, another insisting on restraint, and a crown that cannot afford either extreme. At some point, the discussion simply stalled. Not resolved, not softened, just stalled. No agreement, no roadmap, no sense of closure. The meeting ended not with reconciliation, but with distance. Emotional, if not physical. And as Harry left that room, according to those briefed afterward, there was a realization settling in on both sides. Whatever happened next in court would not stay confined to the courtroom. And once the testimony resumed, there would be no way to pretend this conversation never happened. What's striking, looking back at this week, is how little of it was actually public. The cameras captured Prince Harry arriving at court, entering, leaving. The careful neutrality of legal language. The familiar rhythm of a high-profile case moving forward. But the part that may matter most, the part that could shape what comes next, happened out of view, behind closed doors, without notes, without witnesses who can be cross-examined. If the accounts are accurate, that meeting didn't produce compromise. It didn't reset relationships. It didn't even pause the momentum. In some ways, it may have done the opposite. It clarified positions, hardened them, turned long-simmering tensions into something acknowledged, even if still unspoken. And that matters, because trials don't unfold in a vacuum. When Harry returns to the witness box, he won't just be responding to lawyers. He'll be carrying the weight of that conversation. The knowledge that his pursuit of accountability isn't just challenging a media company. It's challenging a family structure that depends on containment, on unresolved things staying unresolved. That's the real contradiction at the heart of this story. The monarchy survives by looking forward, by smoothing over fractures and projecting continuity. Harry, in this moment, is doing the opposite. He's insisting on looking back, on naming what happened, on forcing decisions that were once deferred into the open. Neither position is irrational, but they cannot easily coexist. And if you're wondering why this alleged confrontation matters now, during this specific trial, consider what's at stake beyond a verdict. Testimony has a way of expanding. Context invites questions, and questions don't respect hierarchy. Once they're asked publicly, they don't stay neatly focused on one defendant or one claim.